Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for having me. It's always great for us to get, us academics, getting out of the office and actually being able to speak to community. We don't do that often enough, and so always jump on the opportunity when it presents itself. So thank you, Jane, for the invitation. Thank you for coming. I mean, as the title suggests, I want to say a few words about the Anthropocene, sort of explain a bit what it is. It sounds like you have a working familiarity with the concept. And I'm a bit concerned anyway that much of what I have to say are things you already know, perhaps by a different name or using a different lens. But I think much of what I will tell you is the kind of information that probably brings you together as part of this transition town movement in the very first place. So if I'm boring you, by all means jump in, let me know. And I'm more than happy to just drop all my notes and any pictures that I have to show and just have a conversation. So I'm quite flexible as far as the format goes. Provocatively, you probably agree with it anyway, tinkering with the Anthropocene, suggesting that we are, I don't think, paying too much attention to what's actually really going on in terms of global environmental change. The first few slides are just pretty much stories of doom and gloom. So it's my bread and butter business and sustainability to scare people into submission to then listen to our proposed solution. But it is basically a brief explanation as to what the Anthropocene is and as to why it is something we would be ignoring at our peril. So the world's doomsday clock, there is such a thing. It dates back to the Cold War, where physicists, atomic physicists, were pretty much trying to judge the level of precariousness, if you like, at the peak of the Cold War. And I think the closest we got to midnight meaning doom and gloom, and a nuclear holocaust, I think the closest we got was 9 or 10 minutes to midnight at the peak of the Cold War. At present, the clock stands at around 2.5 minutes to midnight. Similar as an analog to the Cold War, there is still the nuclear threat, which was pretty much the key driving force in the 50s and 60s. And it's still an issue today. But now the second biggest driver, explaining also as to why the clock is so close to midnight, is in fact climate change and all the problems that are associated with it. For one, it's the biophysical ramifications of it, that things will simply get warmer, the social consequences of it, the economic consequences of it, and the sociopolitical and geopolitical consequences of it. That whole toxic mix basically explains as to why a very conservative bunch of experts, one also needs to stress, these are people who don't take notions of crisis lightly, they don't use that language lightly. So it's a very considered opinion when experts from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists would suggest it's 2.5 minutes to midnight. What it suggests is that we have kind of entered a whole new era of risk and precariousness and uncertainty. And Earth system scientists, so these are, again, a conservative bunch of experts concerning themselves with environmental systems, global environmental systems. They have started to make sense of that new risk, an era of uncertainty, and they've given it a name. And that name is the Anthropocene, suggesting that we have left the stability of the Holocene period, which we've been in, now and I've got some data to tell you the right thing, we've been living now in the Holocene for the last 12,000 years. So that since the last ice age, we've enjoyed a great deal of climatic stability thanks to the Holocene, and we're now seemingly been exiting this period of stability, entering what is now called the Anthropocene, the age of humankind. Not just because we have such a profound impact on the weather, that's one of many impacts we are having as a species. We are overall the world's largest telluric force. That means we have a greater impact on environmental system than earthquakes, tectonic shifts, erosion. All these natural forces are dwarfed by the impact that humankind is having in a physical sense on the planet. So in that sense, the environment becomes increasingly not just littered with human fingerprints all over it, it becomes increasingly a creation of humankind. So that everything environmental is anthropogenically mediated or affected one way or another. Now, the International Commission on Stratigraphy still has to make a decision whether it adopts the name. So officially we are still living in the Holocene, but within the next year a decision is likely to be made as to whether that new name will be adopted. So really an entire new geological epoch that is dominated by a single species. That is us. So the Anthropocene in many ways can be told as a human success story. Ever since World War II, we have been able to harness natural forces and deploy technologies that made, on the one hand, our life more comfortable, and we've ultimately solved a whole raft of economic problems as a result of that immense success. Sanitation, electrification, urbanization, all of these things were possible because we're pretty clever cookies, in a nutshell. So, on the one hand, the Anthropocene, if you look at socioeconomic trends, these are the kind of things we were able to achieve in terms of the damming rivers, for instance, a dramatic increase in transportation, telecommunication, especially in the second half of last century. You will see that the story of human progress is one that can largely be depicted in the shape of exponential curves. Everything is simply going through the roof at a very dramatic pace. Accelerating since the Second World War, since 1945, and that's why Earth system scientists call this phenomenon, if you like, the Great Acceleration. Some of these things we've been doing, the century prior, using fossil fuels, for instance. Just the sheer scale of that technological deployment has accelerated to such an extent that all of this has dramatically gone up. And I can give you some figures that kind of speak to that success in terms of us taking control of this dominion, planet Earth. 84% of land that is ice-free is under direct human influence. Some examples, cropland cities occupy around a third of the Earth's land area. 90% of all photosynthesis occurs in anthropogenic biomes. Humans and all their domestic animals make up 97% of total biomass. That means all wildlife in the world makes up nearly 3% of biomass. So it just speaks to, in terms of proportion, it gives us a sense of how much of an impact humankind is having. And in that sense, human development is a global phenomenon. It's simply felt everywhere.
Now, so there is an ecological analog to that can also be shown in the shape of exponential curves. These are the Earth system trends. And it is precisely these observations that have prompted Earth system scientists to make the call that what we're actually looking at is a new epoch, that we are looking at an Anthropocene. In that we are the biggest driver of greenhouse gas emissions in relation to carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, directly affecting surface temperatures, directly affecting the degree of rate of ocean acidification, directly affecting, in terms of patterns, especially urban environments, stratospheric ozone concentrations, nitrogen loading in coastal areas, the marine catch, which has been peaking in recent years and has since been declining. The list goes on. So, as we've become more successful, if you like, in subjugating environmental systems and controlling them, the environmental feedback has been a negative one, in the sense that environmental systems find it incredibly, or increasingly difficult to withstand or to cope with that level of resource use and intensity of land use by humankind. So, and in that sense, it is unsurprising, and this is sort of a story that we've been telling since the 60s, that humanity's footprint, ecological footprint, is simply getting too large, and that basically since the 1960s, we as a species are actually using more than what the planet can provide. So we're basically running an overdraft facility, if if you like, with environmental systems. You can do that for a while without the world collapsing. The question is how far you push the envelope. And there's no linearity to any of this. It's not like 1 degree warming has a proportional environmental response. There are threshold effects, and at some stage systems can simply entirely alter and change. So how much of a deficit we grow, you know, is yet to be seen. We're on a 2-planet trajectory, so there's no reduction in size. So we're running an ecological deficit. And that manifests in a whole raft of different ways. So, for example, you've seen it in Anthropocene graphs that biodiversity loss is at record levels. Extinction rates are 100 to 1,000 times around the normal background levels. In fact, extinction rates are higher than they've been for the last 65 million years, so a long time. Coral reefs, which provide us with, in economic terms, with value to the tune of around 350 billion US dollars per year, are the most relevant ecosystems. And under a Paris target of 2 degrees would be at risk of being entirely warm. So Paris, which is sort of held as a gold standard for smart climate policy, is an insufficient climate target. The 1.5 degree report that was produced by the government panel on climate change basically makes it very plain that 1.5 degrees is already a dramatic increase, and an increase of a magnitude that will put at risk a whole raft of different species, so coral ecosystems in particular. And it has an impact on food security, it has an impact on people's lives and livelihoods and survival. And as you've seen on the doomsday clock, this whole problem of displacement that is associated with it, that we are looking at a growing number of people directly affected by environmental change needing to go elsewhere. Island nation states are, in the case of point in relation to climate change, these people will go somewhere, they will need to go somewhere, and that will become a major political headache for leaders around the world. In terms of footprints, are you familiar with Earth Overshoot Day? Sorry, Earth Overshoot Day.
Is it still August? Is it still in August sometime?
It was in July last year. Thanks to Corona, it was in August. It was 22nd of August this year. So this is the day, celebrating is the wrong word, we're marking the day. So basically that's the day in the year that we would reach once nature's budget is basically exhausted by humankind. If we do it well, if we live within our budget, we would not exhaust the budget before the 31st of December each year. But what we've seen over the last 30 years that Earth Overshoot Day is moving forward each year. Only this year, because of COVID, we went from what was the 29th of July last year to what was the 22nd of August this year. If we all were to live, so extrapolating from the Australian way of life, globally, if we all were to live like Australia, when would we be marking Earth Overshoot Day, do you think?
March.
March, the expected date, 31st of March. So it kind of speaks volume in terms of how economic choices, lifestyle decisions, and so forth have a bearing on how a nation interacts with the natural world and the kind of impact it is having. Now, in Australia, not that we're single-handedly responsible for this picture or these pictures we are seeing here, but Australia certainly on a per capita basis plays its part, having some of the largest per capita emissions in the world. We're kind of a bit like a petri dish, if you like, when it comes to the Anthropocene, because most of the ill effects that are associated with that epoch we have a first-hand experience of, in the sense that basically all weather anomalies we can witness, and we've been basically exposed to it, to this entire range of different climate phenomena if you like, just within the small space of the last 12 months. We kind of had it all. We had record-breaking drought up until the end of last year, and preconditions for historically unprecedented fire season, immediately followed by floods. So we pretty much had it all. And this is very much in keeping with precisely the forecasts we've been getting from climate scientists and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So in that sense, we are following trend projections. And of course, what's alarming in this regard is that Australia is particularly vulnerable because of our geography, because of where we are, and in the sense that some of our regions will be affected disproportionately when it comes to climate change. So 2-degree warming, it sounds pretty subtle. 2 degrees extra doesn't sound like much, but for the southwest of WA, that could translate into localized increases of up to 4 degrees, which is dramatically more. So again, that will dramatically affect the way in which we will be able to produce our own food. It will affect livelihoods, it will affect infrastructure. We see train lines, for instance, buckle already in 45-degree heat in places like Melbourne, Sydney, and Perth. If we have prolonged heat waves, so this is not just a matter of 1 or 2 days per year, but having that on a prolonged basis over a couple of weeks, ultimately wreaks havoc with everything we've got. So, in that sense, so I will not label any more figures because I think we kind of get the idea as to where we are going, and that this ultimately spells bad news in terms of environmental health, human health, economic health, and political stability. All of that is at risk if this runaway scenario goes unchecked. I guess the argument is the Anthropocene is here. It's kind of the question of how can we navigate this? Earth system scientists are quite clear on one thing, that a return to the Holocene, it doesn't quite look like that. You can't just turn back the clock. It's just a matter of making sure that this epoch doesn't become as pronounced as it might be if we're not doing anything. So it's a question of how can we smartly navigate this. Now, on that, at the moment, and this is why the title of tonight's talk is Tinkering, and arguably that's exactly what we're doing, because the kind of policy descriptions in relation to climate energy policy and the like don't really pay great deal of attention to the climate reality that we are facing. So on the one hand, we still believe in existing infrastructure and existing industries which are still being propped up and maintained, and we're making important commitments to a Paris target that science already tells us is insufficient. And even our COVID recovery is going to be pretty much driven by non-renewable resources as opposed to renewables. So in that sense, we don't really get the right policy signals. It's not just a federal phenomenon, also in Western Australia. There's still a political appetite, for instance, to tap into unconventional gas reserves. Due to fugitive emissions, the methane profile is rather tremendous, and you can see in the infographic here that, if we were to tap just one of those existing wells, we would basically produce an equivalent of 120 coal-fired power stations in terms of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. It's, on the one hand, welcome news in terms of employment generation, to a limited degree, in terms of its impact on groundwater, human health, future land productivity, and so forth. Unconventional gas has little going for it. But in that sense, we have not politically changed tech for a whole raft of reasons, and it would be a different seminar if we were to talk about that at length. Suffice to say that what we are doing right now does not, in substance, in any great measure, address the key issues that have given rise to the Anthropocene in the very first place. Thus, we are tinkering. Now, Australia is not alone in that. It's a global phenomenon in many ways. But in terms of good news, we see, for one, there's no silver bullet to the Anthropocene. We don't see any country that gets everything right. But here are some select examples, for instance, of places where attempts are being made to bring things into the right direction in certain areas, whether it's sustainable urban design, whether it's the decarbonisation of inner cities by making them entirely car-free. Cities like Copenhagen, Oslo, especially Northern Europe, is very much at the forefront of producing or creating car-free cities within the next 5 years. In countries like Germany, combustion engines will no longer be able to be registered as new cars from 2025 onwards. So, you know, we see that there are quite progressive changes being made. Is it fast enough? Is it good enough? That's in the eye of the beholder, but we can see that a lot more is being done than in places like the United States or here in Australia. But we have a positive example close to home. For one, the greatest density of transition towns is Perth. So we have the most transition towns in the country. Close to home, we got the One Planet Certified Council, the city of Fremantle. So we see that at the grassroots level, more often than not, far more is being done than at a state or a federal level, not just here in Australia, but in general. Some of the most progressive cities like Portland, Oregon in the United States, is no comparison between what comes out of Washington in terms of climate policy and what's being done locally. Now come back to that point, because it is along the scene where we see the most movement in reaction to environmental change. I'm going to change hands. This is tough. Okay. Now, I'm unplugged. Do you still hear me?
On the one hand, politicians could be forgiven for their lack of imagination when it comes to addressing big-ticket issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, or the Anthropocene as it is. Largely because we have no historical analog for that. There's nothing to go by. It is something, there is no experience with change of that kind. The closest we have is indigenous experience when it comes to climate change adaptation, because these indigenous cultures have been around for long enough to have seen enough environmental change. But again, not of that scale and not of that speed. So there's no human analog for that. Notwithstanding, we still see steadfast adherence to policies that's perhaps served us well throughout the Holocene period, but it is already predictable that they will not serve us well moving forward into the Anthropocene. And I guess the snapshot of tinkering examples in Australia gives us some clues that we are not quite ready yet to take that step. And arguably, and that's a hypothesis, arguably this has to do with the way we're making sense of the Anthropocene. On the one hand, we can look at these diagrams, at these exponential curves, and say, oh, gee whiz, we have created a lot of change. And science is pretty much on the same page when it comes to the question what the current state of play is. There is agreement amongst scientists, even though it's always framed that there is, discord amongst climate scientists. No such thing. What there is disagreement on, though, is what are the origins of the Anthropocene? How did we get here? And these different readings of the past shed light on how different groups subscribing to different versions of the past propose different solutions. Now, the dominant Anthropocene narrative, the key or the dominant explanation as to why we are living now in the Anthropocene is basically a very simple one, that around 200 years ago, in the context of the Industrial Revolution, innovations like the steam engine, James Watt, he's to blame, and the large-scale adoption of these technologies, so maladaptive technologies, if you like, are ultimately responsible for having a runaway climate change scenario, biodiversity loss, and all these sorts of things. That's a dominant story, and we've supercharged that or turbocharged that from 1945 onwards, the Great Acceleration, as one explanation as to how we got here. Now, if that's a version of the past one would champion, and the problem, so the root cause of the problem is poor technology, then the shorthand solution would basically be we simply have to change the kind of technologies that we are using. But there is no critical investigation of whether our nature-society relationship is is the right one, or whether there may be other drivers at work that go beyond technology. The future will be technologically underpinned, there is no doubt about that. And environmental organizations rightfully point to the great need to adopt cleaner and smarter technologies, and I'm not arguing against that. But I'm merely raising the question as to whether technology solely can fix the mess. Is there a technological fix, if you like, to the Anthropocene? The most high-tech future version of that would be geoengineering, where we entirely engineer the environment, making it suitable for human survival. That would be the logical conclusion, to really totally drive or to totally play the technology card, if you like, to make environmental conditions amenable to human life and survival. So we could ask, as an alternative, to look at this very relationship between us and nature, and whether this very hierarchical approach that we've got is likely to serve us well in future, or whether this is something that would require critical reflection. Further, we could ask the question whether Western capitalism is compatible with environmental systems. Can capitalism ever be a good caretaker of environmental system, or is the very metabolism of capitalism incompatible with environmental processes, because there is no limiting principle within capitalism. Capitalism has, we can either grow, or we can, what we have right now, have a recession. There's no stop button, or there's no slow go button. Capitalism cannot adjust its processes to environmental processes, and in that sense is almost by design on a collision course with environmental system. It didn't matter so much in the early days of Western capitalism, which has, I think, its origins in the 13th century, when the first European traders started to make a living not from working the land, but from selling the goods and producing other things, and starting to trade them globally. And even then we looked at micro extinctions wherever these traders started to take hold, but the scale of intervention was relatively small. 700 years later, the scale has gone truly global, especially since the Vietnam War, and as a result we see these micro extinctions becoming macro extinctions, micro environmental change becoming macro environmental change. And as someone who teaches sustainability, what is striking, and this is what students struggle to get their head around, is that much of it is not just a question of how we're reading the past, but also how we're describing it in the kind of language that we are using. And it is language use that is particularly problematic, especially within the sustainability space. Sustainability, in a nutshell, is meant to be the antidote to the Anthropocene. Arguably, if we would have gotten sustainability right 30, 40 years ago, the Anthropocene wouldn't have emerged. Now, but how is it possible that we've made global commitments in the late 1980s and early 1990s that sustainable development is meant to be our development paradigm from here on in? And nothing really has changed in terms of the overall trajectory, the way in which we have gone. And that is largely that, notwithstanding that we have adopted recycling, resource recovery programs, we've become greener, smarter, cleaner, leaner, we have done all these things. But at the same time, we have grown at a pace that have completely negated the ecological benefits that we have produced as a result of smarter technologies. So the rate of innovation couldn't keep up with the rate of impact generation. And parallel to that is that the language of sustainability has changed, which started off basically as a critical notion, radical notion that we ultimately have to limit what we're doing because capitalism doesn't have a speed limit. The Limits to Growth report in the early 70s was pretty much predicting that by the end of this century, systems would collapse. This model, which was primitive in the 70s, has been rerun independently by CSIRO scientists. We are on track. We are on track with the standard run of that 1971 model. And that is because we have changed the way we're using or interpreting sustainability. So rather than pointing out that growth is a problem, it is now growth that is meant to give us sustainability. this is possible because we've ultimately said that sustainability is about finding the right balance between human needs, environmental needs, and economic needs. It's almost as all three dimensions have been put on the same footing. But they're not. We have an environmental envelope that dictates what can and can't be done on this planet. By putting the economy and ecology on the same footing, we can then start to cherry pick as to which aspect we're going to champion. And when we talk about social sustainability, we're talking about jobs and livelihoods. There's an economic answer. Environmental protection costs money. Again, we need a healthy economy to make that possible. And if you look at the political discourse over the last 30 years, has always very much been a question of, well, how can we run our economy so as to produce the necessary financial means to keep people employed and to direct money towards environmental protection. So in that sense, sustainability is now meant to be achieved by way of economic development. So the greatest threat to a healthy environment is a poorly running economy. And we will find variations of that discourse coming from industry, especially heavy industry and mining, as well as governments of various political persuasions. So it's a redefinition, it's a recoding, if you like, of sustainability. And it is certainly no longer, in the eyes of critics, a concept that has maintained the radical thrust it used to have in the 60s and 70s, where it was a system critique. And now it's almost as if the system has appropriated the terminology, but things don't really have changed. Which would help explain as to why the Anthropocene has pretty much been able to emerge despite efforts within the sustainability space. And that makes it particularly hard for the individual, like the concerned citizens like you, who are here spending a Thursday evening. I'm sure you could do a million other things, but you choose to be here because it's a kind of topic that matters. But it's hard to get your head around the question, well, what can the individual do? The problems, everything that I've described thus far is global in scope. The individual cannot stop biodiversity loss. The individual cannot stop climate change or any of the other large system changes that we are currently experiencing. So for global issues, by comparison, we are too small. Our sphere of influence is too small. Yet, here I am going to tell you that despite that very real problem, the individual, especially as a collective, can do an awful lot. In that combined, our agency and our spheres of influence increase dramatically. Now, in terms of what the individual as an individual ought to do in terms of rectify the problems in relation to large footprints and so forth, the order of the day there is very clear. We have to become one planet individuals. At the moment, we're 1.5 planet individuals. So we need individually and collectively impact reduction. Has any one of you done an ecological footprint quiz? May I ask, sir, what the outcome of that was?
Like 4, I think.
Were you shocked? 4 planets. If everyone was to live like you, we needed 4 planets to make that possible. What were your impact areas? Do you remember what explained your large footprint?
I'm sort of guessing there, but driving a car was one of the big ones. Not having insulation in the house was another big one.
Yeah.
Using gas, hot water was another one. Those are the ones I can think of at the top of my head.
Yeah, thank you. Well, these are key areas. Other ones, transport, especially air travel.
Oh, air travel, yeah, that's a big one.
It's because even if your house was to be 5-star energy rated, if you travel by plane, you're basically negating all of those benefits from a footprint calculation point of view. Food choices have an enormous impact on the ecological footprint.
Because you can offset your carbon footprint, plant trees down in the southwest, whatever. But you're still affecting, if you eat a lot of meat, you're affecting the Amazon and you're affecting pastures in Australia and all that kind of thing. It's a lot deeper than just carbon footprint.
Oh, it is bigger than that. It's also water, especially clothing, the water intensity of clothing. Plus, yeah, you're right. It's much bigger than climate. That's a good point. But fundamentally, on all these scores, basically, impact reduction is the order of the day. So for the one planet individual, if you like, it is a matter of becoming aware that Earth's resources are finite, so resources are limited. We have to adjust our behavior accordingly and basically use best available information to make that possible. And that's a tough sell. It's a tough sell in a Western society, because ultimately that is a message of having to do with less. It's a message of deprivation, which is politically unpopular. But what we are finding, especially if you look at the literature on downshifting, for instance, where people shift from full-time employment to part-time employment, simply because they're tired of the rat race, they decide to do with less but to have more time. That ultimately their quality of life has improved, it has become less materialistically underpinned, but they have more time for family, friends, hobbies, the kind of pursuits that they're interested in. And the biggest problem that they had after the initial adjustment period was the opinion of others who had to critically reflect on their very own choices. As the biggest obstacle is the social stigma attached with not wanting to play the mainstream game. But it could be enriching to have less, because we're now also learning more and more from happiness economics about the disutility of having a lot. That a lot of property, a lot of ownership comes with its own set of problems. And that a simpler life can sometimes be a lot more fulfilling. Again, we could talk a whole evening just on that topic. But fundamentally, it is the marching orders are very clear. It's about impact reduction, and it's best done as a group, as a community, as a society, rather than just as an individual, because you're swimming against a fast-flowing tide. So sharing and connecting with others, just like transition town people do, is the right way forward. The one planet individual is one that wears many hats. The dominant discourse reduces us to that of a consumer. That's largely how we're spoken to. And that's a kind of consumer rationality that we are also asked to employ on a daily basis, making economically rational decisions. But they can run counter to my role as a community. It may be economically rational to act one way, but it may not do miracles to my community. And so ecologically rational decisions is ultimately what's being called for. And they can be economically savvy, which we're increasingly recognizing. So one of the most democratic activities on a daily basis is going shopping, because we decide who gets our money. The same is true by maintaining an investment portfolio if we're fortunate to have one. But here we can make our money go in a particular way and making sure the money is put to good use. So we can help divest out of fossil fuel, for instance. And it's, again, not just climate, there are other problem areas. But we can give it to companies, organizations that deserve to have our money, or causes that we support, and the same is true when it comes to our consumption choices. Making political choices on election day that would further environmental causes rather than necessarily give us the next tax break. So the outlook is one where we're looking at planet and community rather than just the individual. So we're making decisions as an individual, but not just for us, because there are ripple effects from the decisions that we are taking. We can also be an activist. In effect, we can be an activist in all those capacities to basically make sure that we're trying to affect change with every kind of activity that we're doing on a daily basis. In the way you vote, the way you shop, the way you invest, the way you engage as a community member. All these can be forms of protest, if you like, or be consistent with a particular environmental/social ethic. All of that is possible. Now for that But for that to work, we need a robustness when it comes to the institutions within which we live, and that robustness ought to be protected. And it is, like a democracy is vulnerable if it is not nurtured. So all these institutions need nurture, they need care, they need active citizenship that demands the robustness of those institutions. If we stop doing that, that robustness will fade. And it's currently being tested left, right, and center across the Western world. And these demands can only come from active and engaged citizens who do not just know how the political process works, they understand their role within the political process and exercise that right but also that responsibility on being politically engaged. And here we come back to the point that it is not just about what do I get out of a particular political platform, what does a particular policy package deliver to my back pocket, for example, what are the larger societal ramifications of that, what are the ecological consequences of certain choices. People are not experts, for instance, on questions of environmental impact or human impact on unconventional gas, for example. It proved unpopular over East. We had a moratorium here in Western Australia and had a partial lift. And it is the more marginal areas north of Perth that are ultimately now available to that industry. Now, as a non-expert, it is hard to reach a decision. And again, it is then a matter of, okay, what information is out there and what if in doubt? How would one decide? There's an economic argument in support of that industry, but there's a whole raft of arguments against it. So if you were to financially gain from it, that would be a decision in favor, but looking more broadly at societal and ecological consequences, the scientific answer would be no, and in that sense, then also the individual answer may need to be no, that this is not a development direction that we may want to go. Okay, so in that sense, as an individual, we sit in all these three spheres. We engage on a daily basis with the market system. We engage in not quite so regular intervals with the government. We can write letters on a daily basis, but by and large, especially within the Westminster system, our engagement is reduced to referenda and elections. But we can be more active than that. And of course, we are members of civil society, so it's basically us and everything we stand for, everything that we believe we can bring to bear in all these three spheres, if you like, in ways I've outlined. That in the market we act as pro-social, pro-environmental consumers, that we vote according to those values as well, and demand the kind of things that we believe would make a good, just, fair, and environmentally responsible society. And that as a community member that we engage and take action in areas that are important to us in our communities. Now you could say, well, I've been part of this transition group for the last 10 years and we've been able to achieve diddly squat because the system is stacked against us, that there are real structural constraints and no one will listen. True. So here am I, just an armchair academic who basically spruiks these messages and say, well, if you do that, positive and nice things will happen. You may have enough lived experience to say that this is not quite so. Yes and no. I would agree with that, and I would agree also that the cards are stacked against you. At the same time, history shows, like independence in India with Mahatma Gandhi, civil rights in the United States, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, civil rights United States, Lech Wałęsa, basically the union movement in Poland. Even unpopular revolutions like the rise of neoliberalism under Milton Friedman during the Reagan administration in the United States. So here's basically the mouthpiece of Chicago School's economics, which we have also wholeheartedly adopted here in Australia. All these individuals were, if you like, trailblazers, and one way or another, the faces of societal change. in situations where, or at times where nobody believed that Indian independence was possible, that civil rights in the United States and race segregation in the United States, that this would ever change. History now tells us that change did occur. The Iron Curtain fell as well. Poland became a democracy, as did most other Eastern European countries. This might also be a possible societal change. And who knows, this may be the face of it. Greta Thunberg, who is basically the face of student protest on climate change. So I come back to this, yes. It may not work every time in every community for every individual, but at the same time, history tells us that it does happen. The heartening news is that we've seen, if you like, a very steep rise of the kind of activism that people like Greta Thunberg stand for and engage in. So there is a new groundswell, if you like, that we haven't seen for quite a long time. The 90s really lulled us in, the supposed end of history, the end of ideological battles between the East and the West. I don't know. Environmentalism and social change and all of that almost was parked. We didn't really engage. It is only with the new millennium that this has slowly started to gain some momentum again. And it's especially over the last 5 years that things have really ramped up. And when we look at tipping point theory, so what makes a system tip from one state to the next? So when do you reach a critical inflection point that change is inevitable? So for climate change, the question is it 2 degrees? And beyond that, we will have a runaway scenario. Is it 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees? Where's the tipping point where system change will occur? This would be the ecological or Earth system analog. We also can think of system or tipping points in system change within social systems. When did genes take off and what took that? Or when did certain attitudes change? What did it take for that to happen? And what we generally find is that you have your trailblazers, you have your innovators, the ones who are very much becoming the face of what could become a new trend, the Greta Thunbergs, if you like. It could be School Strike for Climate, it could be Extinction Rebellion, the divestment movement. These, if you like, are your initiators, the troublemakers who run against or swim against the tide, run against the mainstream. We have a new breed of businesses, the zero-nodes, that basically have not just lukewarm company pledges to gradual impact reductions. These are big firms, serious businesses that have made a pledge for zero impact. Not by 2050, but by 2020, 2021. Measurable, reporting against those achievements. Climate neutral businesses who actually, not just on a climate, but overall net zero environmental impact score sheet. This is how they wish to perform and wish to be judged by that in years to come by their investors and customers. Whole new type of business. Organizations like this who chip away at change at a local level. Whole new corporations designed for the sole purpose of creating social good, accompanied by an untold number of social and eco-social enterprises that are being born left, right, and center. The literature is awash with examples of these types of businesses taking off because there's a growing appetite for things to go differently. And COVID, upon reflection, even though everybody was mostly inconvenienced, unless directly affected, by basically the restrictions that came with it. But social scientists have been going around the cities asking people, how has it been, how has the lockdown been? And many appreciated their city a lot more because it was a lot less busy. And on the question of sustainable urban living, for many that is not a way of going back to pre-COVID times. They ultimately would like the city to be different. So there's also a lot of positives to be taken away from that sort of scenario. So we are increasingly also becoming aware that things could be done differently, that there is not just one best way of doing things. In many ways, the statistics I've shown you right at the beginning suggest that things haven't been going that great in the first place. So what we need for a transition town movement to be successful is to not just be the innovators, we need them, but it is far more important as to who follows. Yeah? So what a movement needs is to cross the 30% mark, and then you have a runaway change scenario. The best example I can give you is rooftop solar in Perth, which wasn't really greatly supported by government. It was very, very expensive to do, and it just took a minor economic incentive to just take the pain out of that first investment 10 years ago, where a solar installation would have still put you back around $10,000. But it was the first people who put solar on their roof, the early adopters, not the very early ones in the 70s, where it would have cost you $20,000 to put on your roof, but I'm talking about in more recent times, the early adopters. We're now talking about a penetration rate of above 90% by the end of the decade. And that is without government incentive. It will simply happen because it's simply good economics, household economics. It's a good individual rational decision, which just so happens that it coincides also with being much better than coal-fired power, centrally distributed. So the holy grail from tipping point theory when it comes to social tipping points is you have to be able to upscale your efforts to ultimately get to that magical 30% box, and then it will simply happen. So in that sense, the scenarios here, the question is how many people run with them? Will you run with them? Will you buy from them? Will you invest in them? If you get a critical mass, one example is Super Future. Have you heard of that? Have you heard of that super fund?
Future Super.
Future Super. It's basically a divestment superannuation fund. So you're based, and they're transparent in their investment formula. Most super funds would be very cagey when it comes to going public with their investment strategy. They're making it plain for everyone to see because they want people to emulate it. Again, giving people who think about where to put their nest egg money an option to decide differently. This is not an endorsement, this is just an example of what could be done. And fundamentally, and that comes back then to the individual, but it's also a broader societal question as well, how do we interact with environmental systems? How do we live sustainability in the workplace, at home, in our society, in all those places? That ultimately, fundamentally determines the kind of impact we're having. All right, so keep doing what you're doing. Stop tinkering.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. So, like, we go to a lot of local council meetings, and I kind of get the sense that some councillors is just like they don't understand sustainability at all. And you said like we need to push for robust, government systems in this. Is it that we need to be standing for local government, or do we have to try and educate them? Like, because I just feel like we can go to council meetings and talk about we need a climate emergency. Please don't clear this bushland, but they don't get it. I'm not just talking about City of Swan, I'm talking about a number of different local councils. What do you do?
It's a good question, and it's probably not unique to Guildford. The whole sustainability stuff is hard to sell, and for one, it has become so diluted, and you have, in the literature, there are over 500 going definitions of what it even means. So we've kind of destroyed what started off being such a beautiful concept in many ways. And it's a bit like climate change. People have sustainability fatigue. And in that sense, it is very, very difficult to get people excited about it. And it has deprivation undertones. Again, sustainability means change, it means being uncomfortable. The subtext of it is not attractive in the eyes of many. Also, and you're right, there is a lack of appreciation of how important it might be. It's the same with the Anthropocene. I mean, the figures basically tell We really have little time to waste, but we don't have really a sense of alarm. But then again, as soon as you ring the alarm bell, the sort of Cassandra scenario, you kill the messenger. We are criminalizing environmental protest. We're doing all these things, even though people act with the best of intentions. So, in answer to your question, and before digressing any further, I think in many ways it's either take on that role yourself, to gain into a position of power to sit on a bigger lever. Or if you try to affect institutions and systems, it's a matter of understanding what their way of thinking is and what their language is. So if it's budget processes, if it's budget discipline, if it's economic return, can a case be made that behavior X is superior over behavior Z because it produces better returns, it produces a better outcome, it enhances livability, it is more efficient, or whatever it might be, whatever would resonate with the receiving end. On moral grounds, things don't happen. Moral suasion could be a compelling argument, but it doesn't change behavior. We've learned that from behavioral science. People won't be guilted into behaving differently, but you can entice them, you can encourage different behavior by speaking something that they're naturally attracted to or something that they respond to favorably. So it's a matter of, I don't talk about sustainability anymore. I try to find a different language around it because sustainability is too hard to sell and it has been appropriated. So it's almost better creating a whole new language around it that people don't have any negative associations with, so a term without baggage. As one strategy, I'm sure there are others, but that's sort of what comes to mind.
Can you give examples of what language you suggest to use instead? Can you give examples of what language you like to use instead of sustainability?
Well, one is livability. Everybody wants to live a good life. Everybody wants to, and out of Latin America, concepts, for instance, Ben Viver and so forth, come from that. Eudaimonia is another concept. It's an old Aristotelian idea of living the good life. It's something that everybody would aspire to. We have different names, again, that we are financially healthy, that we have enough retirement funds. We have different connotations of what that means in a material sense. But when you ask people what's a good life, they will talk about music, they will talk about food, they will talk about activities that give them a fulfilled life. Money in the bank account is a necessary but insufficient condition for the good life. But in many ways, that's what we've reduced it to. Now, sustainability as something that can take care of the environmental dimension whilst making sure that people are living well, then people wouldn't care so much whether environmental protection is a happy byproduct of the pursuit of the good life. But at the moment, the narrowly construed pursuit of the good life runs at the expense of the planet. So it's addressing that balance. But putting it in those terms puts people off because they don't want to be guilty. They don't want to be implicated in the mess that we have created. Nobody wants to be responsible. And in many ways, we are also victims of having constrained choices. If you live in the bush, you're dependent on a car. There's only one supermarket selling one thing. So, we can't always make the best consumer choices. And then the responsibility is with the providers and producers and manufacturers, the government. So we can only affect what we can affect. But as a language example, I would highlight the positives. What the environmental movement has completely failed and has, over the last 40, 50 years, is to basically zoom in on the negatives, highlighting all the things that are wrong. And rightfully so, because there's a lot to point your finger at. But the language of doom and gloom is insufficiently motivating. We have not been able to sell a vision for a sustainable future. We have not found the language for that. We don't have good imagery for that. We know what the antithesis looks like, dystopian notions of unsustainability in the future. But what does a beautiful world look like? What does a beautiful 2050 look like that maximizes livability, that gives us a richness in human artifacts which are not produced at the expense of the planet, where people will get along well? What sort of society would that be? What would it look like? What would it take to get there?
I think David Gamo covered that in his film 2040.
Yes, yes.
Looking at what we could do with the
And that's the beauty of it, that in many ways, much of the technological change does not need another 10 years for it to be developed, like carbon sequestration. Much of the impact reduction for which we need technology, for that technology is off the shelf. It's already there.
Given that we're already experiencing climate change and more change than ever, shouldn't we start thinking about resilience and adaptation?
That's all we do, because mitigation, we're already there. There is very little emphasis on mitigation because it's not taken seriously. We're probably not going to meet Paris globally. And in terms of research, what happens at university, the research emphasis is on mitigation and is on adaptation. Everybody's bracing for impact in relation to the kind of research that we are doing. It's all about dealing with the change. So, and what that also means in terms of community resilience, but also in terms of resilience of infrastructure and so forth. This is very much where the research effort is going. In recognition of the fact that mitigation to date hasn't been good enough. We would have to dramatically double down efforts. I mean, it's been likened to the kind of warlike mobilization. When Kennedy announced the space program, they had 7 years or sort of, it's that form of mobilization that would always be needed, the kind of zeal with which greenhouse gas emission reductions would need to be taken on. And given the current political discourse, so yes, adaptation is from a science point of view, the next logical step, because mitigation isn't working.
Well, I like to ask this question. We're about 7.5 billion people on this planet at the moment, and they forecast by 2060, 2072, 11 billion on the planet. What impact that would have on the environment?
It's a function of numbers. The impact will grow proportionate to growth in numbers. Of course, if the additional 4 billion people were to live in abject poverty, the impact would be smaller. If they assume Western lifestyles, the impact will be dramatically greater. One way or another, it's undesirable from a human well-being point of view and from a planetary health point of view. 11 billion, well, demographers are unsure as to whether we get there. We're still looking at growth, slower growth, but the numbers are still going up. It's a problem in terms of urbanization, the pressure on cities not being able to keep up with population numbers, food security, all these things. All the problems we have, we magnify by having more people. That is recognized. And in that sense, development is ultimately seen as the savior, because any country that undergoes an economic transition undergoes a demographic transition. You have basically very low, even negative birth rates in developed, highly developed countries. High-income countries have low birth rates. But is it a function of development, or is it a function of other factors like female education, access to contraception, women's rights, and control over their own reproductive system, and these sorts of things, which normally goes part and parcel with, not always, but often has gone part and parcel with development. That's why the focus has often been so much on development, which is true in as much as that an agrarian society needs more hands on the farm than a family of accountants. You don't need a large number of offspring to keep that business going, whereas a farm needs a lot of people. Yeah, so we can see how development plays into it, but a lot of it is actually to do with the role of women, education, and culture, women's rights, and all these sorts of things. So there are perhaps means and ways of also driving that without needing to turbocharge development globally. But to answer your question, yes, 11 billion spells more trouble than 7.6 billion. Yes?
What happens at midnight?
What happens we don't want to know what happens at midnight.
Because population is your biggest bugbear. Since 1980, we've gone past the break-even point. Since 1980 to today, we've added 1.6 billion people to this planet, which cannot be fed. cannot be happiness, cannot be anything. We'll try. We'll smash the planet to do it. What are we doing? We don't talk about population. It is the crux.
It's, well, ecological impact is, there's the famous iPad formula, which has population only as one of three factors.
How do you get rid of them? I can get rid of sheep off the planet.
Well, there is probably no ethically permissible way of just getting rid of a perceived excess of 1.6 billion. I mean, in fairness, of course, the more people we have, the greater the problem, but right now we have enough food, we have enough space, we have enough to comfortably feed these extra people on the planet. There's enough to go around. We have never reached levels of wealth globally as we have today. If anything, it is a distribution problem right now. Malnourishment, underdevelopment, these are social constructions. It's not a natural given that you have a third of the population living off the fat of the land and 2/3 living in abject poverty to enable that. It's a distribution problem right now. With 11 billion, you're reaching production thresholds that even science can't fix.
Genetic engineering, stop babies.
Depends also in Australia, per capita, per person, we are using what's the percentage of dramatically more resources than people in developing nations. More people do not use up the planet like we do. So population is only one aspect to see. You mentioned three. You mentioned the other two.
Population, affluence, technology.
How do you talk to people to change people's behaviours if they're concerned in an abstract sense about the planet and so on, but they don't want to change out of their comfortable lifestyles, so they're not going to take any action at all other than maybe put their waste in the right rubbish bin, a recycling bin or something. But how do you talk to people to try to get them to get over that, into that next step of actually doing something outside and possibly reducing their comfortable lifestyle?
I don't think they really want to know.
Well, in many ways, it often is. I mean, we talked about council members perhaps not understanding. Sometimes there are information deficits where further education might help, but more often than not, it isn't. There is a cognitive dissonance that people simply live with because it's easier. And that's also why a denialist discourse, for instance, is attractive, because it helps you wash away that cognitive dissonance, because climate scientists, they're all just in it for themselves, or the case is completely overblown. In fact, it's getting cooler, and all the other crazy theories that we have that might go on with the climate. Because it's easier to accept a fantasy than to face up to the fact that things might, in fact, be really, really bad. And the consequences and the implications that might have for the individual. So how do you deal with that? For people being reluctant to put stuff in the bin, simply make it expensive not to comply. The biggest driver of behavior is changing of social norms and making appeals to social norms. People don't want to be different. They want to, well, they kind of do and they don't, but they don't want to be different in a negative sense. So if all of a sudden social norms are changing where everybody in the neighborhood puts their rubbish in the right bin, and you happen to be the one who doesn't, then this is something you would probably address out of fear of social pressure or social stigma attached. Positive language is generally more attractive than negative language, so we don't shame behavior, we're actually trying to make it fun. This is why gatekeepers are so important. The Greta Thunbergs of the world are important to raise the finger. It is the real important gatekeepers that help us make a difficult sell attractive. Nobody would want solar on their rooftops because it doesn't look that great, and initially it was expensive and you had to be a die-hard greenie to go down that path, it has become a norm, it has become an economically rational choice. And it's now a runaway train that is unstoppable, certainly in Western Australia. And there are other behaviors that were unthinkable in the 70s and 80s that have become standard practices. And recycling is one of those things where now the adoption rate is pretty good. In other things, it's a form of social engineering. It's less talking, it's less convincing. It's just like letting people finding it out for themselves, because all of a sudden the alternative looks more attractive. It's better. And marketing, social marketing, people who work in the social engineering space use nudging approaches and so forth. They gently prod people in the right direction without them even noticing that it is going on. It's a gentle massaging and manipulation of behaviors, in a way.
Some people, when their house has to burn down before they get, catastrophic bushfires.
Yes.
People then, politicians say, "Oh, this is not the time to talk about it," but this is exactly the time. You've got to call it out. That is the cause, and then something will be done.
And people could see through that. When the government tried to play the card that you shouldn't politicize this tragedy, people in affected areas knew exactly that this was the time to talk about it. And there's a shelf life to these forms of political gesturing, I think, and I think there is a crossroads of sorts that we are approaching. It can't, for many of us, it may not come fast enough, but I think there is a shifting tide of. I try to remain an optimist, and if I read it well, I think that it could even well be, even though I'm certainly not a champion of the free market of Western capitalism for that matter, but it could well be that it is market dynamics that will outpace politics in so many ways, because if just big investment sentiment changes, and it gets there, it is getting there, then money will flow very, very quickly from socially and ecologically undesirable businesses to those that are the opposite, desirable. That can happen overnight. Financial flows can be very rapid. And this is where I wouldn't take my money on the markets, but this is where I see an opportunity where the right decision makers who have control over big levers can make very decisive questions. And it kind of doesn't even matter what the government says, because then the market decides. I wish it'd be the other way around, but government decision making is just not there at this stage.
Thanks, Martin. It's always thought-provoking hearing you talk, and I'm sure if people have got any more burning questions, come up to Martin at the end. We wanted to thank Martin with some homegrown garlic.
All right.
Garlic, so.
Keep the vampires away.
Yeah,
awesome.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Great.
We appreciate you coming out for your time.
Thank you.